Welcome, everyone, to the PFF Fantasy Podcast, IDP edition. I'm Jon Macri, and we are 2 weeks away from our first preseason game of the 2024 NFL season. So, naturally, we are going to continue getting you ready for this year's fantasy football campaign by diving into some rankings and rationale for you wonderful, lovely degenerates who are wise enough to include IDPs in their fantasy leagues. So today we are covering the top 24 defensive backs to target for this year. So let's All right, we covered defensive linemen a couple of weeks ago. Today, the focus is on the defensive backs, so that's going to include safeties and cornerbacks. Although naturally, we're talking more safeties than corners within this top 24 because that's just how things typically work for IDP. And then next week, we'll cover our top 24 linebackers as well. So with all that said, I always like to kind of provide some information about the position that I'll be covering within these rankings episodes. And while the rationale for the dynasty episode on defensive backs had a lot to do with kind of the long-term viability combined with consistency at an inconsistent position, it's a little different for redraft. It's obviously going to be different, first off, because we don't care whether or not these guys are going to be starters in 2025 or beyond, or even how old they are. Instead, we still want to look at consistency, but because it's just a focus on 1 year, we can have a better idea of what we do have a better idea of kind of what types of alignments these players might get in their current defensive system for 2024, which for defensive backs plays a huge part in their baseline for success and IDP production potential, specifically tackles, obviously. So, big plays like interceptions, for example, are often what kind of propels DBs to the top scorers on any given week or by season's end, if they were lucky enough to compile a lot of those plays. But they're also more unstable and unreliable to bank on week to week and especially year to year. So we're kind of throwing those out the window as far as trying to predict who is going to get the most interceptions, fumble recoveries, defensive touchdowns, because it's a fool's errand to try and do that. It's just heading into a season, it's just not going to work. So instead, the focus is going to be on the potential for baseline production like tackles, which we can often get a better feel for weekly, annually, however we are managing our DBs in the year. And then if those players also deliver big plays, then that is kind of like the cherry on top and helping us to get even more from our reliable weekly tacklers, right? So I referenced alignments here earlier in being a strong indicator for DB tackling potential. So for those that maybe don't know exactly what that means or what those splits look like, I've pulled up a breakdown of average safety tackle efficiency by their pre-snap alignment from 2021 to 2023, which for those not watching on the YouTube, shout out to those that are, don't forget to like and subscribe. The most efficient tackling alignment for safeties comes from those lined up in the box, which yields an 11.1% tackle efficiency on average. So the box is where you'll typically find most linebackers lining up, and it's just prime tackle territory for any position. And 11.1% tackle efficiency is an elite mark for safeties who on average only yield a 9.1% tackle efficiency. So we're talking 2 points higher than that, which can be a difference of around 20 tackles per year for full-time players, right? And for a position that produces so similarly to one another beyond the big plays, like that's a big advantage to be had for those that can take advantage of those prime IDP alignments. After the box alignment, for whatever reason, wide corner safety yields a 10.4% tackle efficiency, but it's still a really small sample size, even using 3 years worth of data. Like it's rare that the safeties play that alignment. It could maybe be 1 or 2 snaps per week, and that it's really just like outlier numbers here that do vary year to year. Like that number does go up and down more than any other alignment here, but it did for over the past 3 years. For whatever reason, it's second, but not something we're going to bank on. After that, the only other edge is a slight one, especially compared to the box alignment. But the slot also yields an above average tackle efficiency for safeties at 9.6%. So a half point higher than average. So we do like the slot a little bit more than most. And then after that, the more common, like deep free safety alignment comes in at 8.5%. We don't love that, and it's the least efficient tackling spot, second least efficient tackling spot, with the least efficient being the defensive line, which is an important one to note because people often like those guys that are getting snaps like on the edge, for example. But it's important to realize that what they're doing a lot of the time when they're on the defensive line is they're either blitzing on pass plays, which it does obviously increase their chances of a sack, though still pretty hard to convert. And then if it's a run play that they're lined up there, they're often getting manhandled by like an offensive lineman or a tight end where they're not freed up to get tackles. Usually the safeties that get the D-line snaps are also the ones who get a lot of box snaps, and that's just what matters more than anything else and why they're typically more productive as tacklers, not necessarily because the defensive line snaps. So just knowing that when you're looking at like in-season usage is going to be helpful for, tiebreakers for your lineup or whatever. All right. So knowing all of that, the next thing I did when kind of constructing my rankings was creating a projection by taking the most recent data from each team's current defensive coordinator and their past usage of their starting safeties, and then projected that across an entire season. So basically taking, how these defensive coordinators deployed their safeties, whether it was in the box, slot, deep safety, how often they did that, and then trying to project that to a new scheme. Now, it's a loose idea of, which defensive coordinators will have the most kind of IDP friendly deployments for their safeties heading into this year. But it's a good starting point, I think, at least, because there a lot of the times these defensive systems remain pretty similar from defensive coordinator to going to new teams or year to year, whatever. There's obviously going to be some change, but we can get kind of a loose projection, right? We don't expect coordinators to run the exact same defensive scheme that they did in their past season, obviously, but we can usually predict it being pretty similar. And then there are also teams in there. You'll find the article on pff.com. I'll link it in the episode description to get a better idea and get more detail on it. But there's also going to be teams in there that we don't have reliable data for, because there's going to be some first-time defensive coordinators or head coaches who we don't know what to expect until we see them this season. So in that case, we're often banking on the safeties in that system that's themselves to get a feel for what they can be for IDP. And the last part of IDP safety rankings, and one that is very important for IDP managers, rankers, whoever, to realize, is that taking the top scorers from last year and using their finish from last year in order to rank them this year is typically crap, right? It doesn't work because it's such an inconsistent and unstable position year to year to try and predict. So, for those on the YouTube crowd, again, I have a breakdown of kind of my like annual correlation from fantasy points per game and total fantasy points broken down by IDP position. And the numbers here from 2022 to 2023, and this is pretty close every year when I run the numbers. Sometimes safety is better than corner and vice versa. But the main takeaway here is that both safety and corner far and away offer the worst repeat rates across the positions as a whole. So just keeping that in mind as we go through, and you maybe don't see some big play merchant who scored well last year within this top 24, thinking about like a Deron Bland, for example. It's just not something that we can bank on being repeatable again, right? So now that you know where I'm coming from with my rankings, it's time to get into the rankings themselves, where safeties are going to mostly lead the way here. But honestly, as most of you are well aware, it's such a deep position, one that has so much turnover at the top every single year. We know we can fade defensive back as a whole into oblivion for the most part and still find decent production late in drafts. But at the same time, still got to rank them. So if you do want to grab a top 24 guy, then these are my personal favorites. And starting at number one for me, we talk about inconsistent production and usage. Well, there's literally only one player across all the defensive backs over the past 3 years who has finished as a top 5 safety in points per game and also among the top 5 in tackles versus expected. Only one man. It is King Derwin James of the Los Angeles Chargers. So Derwin James last season finished as safety 4 in points per game, safety 5 overall, delivered a 99th percentile performance in tackles versus expected. You'll be able to find the link to the tackles versus expected numbers as well in the episode description. But again, you're just not getting that level of consistency from any other DB, like none. So, for Dynasty, yeah, maybe he's not DB1 anymore as he gets a little bit older. But as far as what we're looking at for this season, that combination of alignment, usage, consistency, all those key things that I just spent, 10 minutes on basically covering at the top of the show, nobody has a better profile for that heading into this year than Derwin James. So even bias aside, with my Derwin jersey behind me here, like he's still going to be DB1 heading into 2024 until he proves otherwise. Next up in the ranks in terms of using like kind of our scale of usage, alignment, consistency, things like that. Chicago Bears safety Jaquan Brisker has been awesome for IDP. Through his first 2 seasons in the league, he was safety 14 in points per game as a rookie, safety 6 in points per game this past year. I'm referencing points per game and fantasy points. I'll have the link to the scoring and the top scores and stuff in the episode description as well. But last year finished 97th percentile in tackles versus expected, including, being the most efficient safety against the run in that regard as well. He was 78th percentile in tackles versus expected as a rookie. Like, I love the potential for Brisker again this year in Chicago. There's a lot to like about him. Chicago's defensive scheme also projects as one of the top 6 for tackle potential based on those past alignments under Matt Eberflus. So expecting another really long year attack. And if he can maintain that strong big play rate, which let's be honest, that's really the hard part, then we're loving him even more in 2024. DB3 for me is Antoine Winfield Jr. He's my dynasty safety 1 and still relatively close here in redraft as well at safety 3. Winfield, arguably the best safety in the entire NFL, but when projecting for IDP, it's okay to move him down to 3 for this season, right? We have to keep in mind that his big play rate, 3.3%, was a top 5 mark last year. It's a very high number that we have to expect some regression in. And so it's hard to put him, as safety 1, 2 years in a row. But that being said, his usage, projected deployment, pass production is still very, very good and consistent, just not necessarily to the levels of Derwin or even Brisker as far as tackle potential goes. So that's the only slight tiebreaker. But if you want Winfield as your DB1, then, I'm not going to blame you. DB4 for me is going to be Kyle Dugger, coming off a breakout season as predicted last season. By the way, stepped into like an actual full-time role with McCourty retiring and still got his ideal alignments, right? That he's been getting as the entire time he's been in New England to produce excellent numbers, and along with that full-time role now, which allowed him to finish as a top 10 safety overall for IDP in 2023. No Bill Belichick this year for Kyle Dugger. Gerard Mayo takes over, so we don't know how much of those Belichickian tendencies are going to carry over for this new regime. But one thing I'm really banking on with Dugger and expecting really is this coaching staff recognizing his strength coming from his play closer to the line of scrimmage, acting as that second linebacker a lot of the time, or working out of the slot, getting some blitz opportunities. Like, that is what Dugger has proven to do best in the NFL, and it's where he makes the most impact. So to me, only makes sense that they continue to deploy him in that way, which should absolutely translate to IDP production just as it did last year. DB5 for me is Brian Branch of America's team, the Detroit Lions. Also technically the first corner. I'm not sure if fantasy platforms have locked in their final position designations for the year just yet, but if we're basing it off his usage last season, he spent 71% of his defensive snaps in the slot as a rookie. I'd expect him to get kind of similar usage in 2024, but apparently he won't be taken off the field nearly as much either. Like if folks remember from last year, the Lions had a very specific game plan for him when he was almost always deployed just when the opposing offense was in 11 personnel, which led to Branch only playing 77% of the team's defensive snaps when he was in the lineup. So this year, the word is that he will get a full-time role, mostly in the slot, but then get a chance to play strong safety as well, which comes with those juicy box snaps that we love so much for IDP. And for a player like Branch, who immediately proved to be an impact player as a rookie, 96th percentile mark in tackles versus expected, ranks second in big play rate, which, again, much like Winfield, we'll expect that number to come down a bit. 1.4% tackle rate at or behind the line of scrimmage. That was a top 5 mark. Like, the dude was amazing. Green lights across the board. Now going to be closer to that 100% of snaps range. How could we not be all in on Brian Branch as a top 5 player heading into this season for IDP? DB6 is Kyle Hamilton of the Baltimore Ravens. Folks who listen to the Dynasty DB episode know I have zero concerns about Hamilton long-term, but for 2024, I can find enough to just barely keep him out of the top 5, which DB6 shouldn't be seen as a knock on Hamilton. It's just more on the proven production of the guys ahead of him. Hamilton surprisingly wasn't the elite tackler last season that we thought he could be. Just 13th percentile in tackles versus expected, so pretty greatly under delivered, I think, in that regard. But he did make up for it. Obviously, top 5 big play rate, which again, not something we want to put all our eggs into that one basket. So we have to take his tackle production into consideration. The good thing is, because of his potential usage and deployment in Baltimore around the line of scrimmage and as a blitzer, on top of just being an incredible talent who is more than capable of making those big plays on any given snap, he's not falling too far behind the top 5 for this year. And I'd absolutely be happy with him as the 6th DB off the board. DB7 for me is Budda Baker, who people were down on last year, while also apparently forgetting that he missed 5 games and not having an understanding that big plays are incredibly volatile, right? Because he didn't have many big plays in 2023, and that's okay. If we look at the 12 games that he did play, he was still very much the same Budda Baker as a tackler that we've come to expect over the years. 90th percentile in tackles versus expected. He was 98th percentile in that regard in 2022 when he played 15 games. He's still very much the elite IDP producer we should be expected. And there's absolutely going to be some positive regression in terms of big plays this year, just as a result of being on the field as much as he is week to week. He was one of my bounce back players when we did that show a few weeks ago with Dynasty Trip. And I fully believe that there's more IDP greatness left in the tank here for Budda in 2024, especially considering that Nick Rallis's defense ranked first in that safety tackle projection experiment that I had ran earlier this offseason. All right, DB8 for me, the first player on the list who will be on a new team this season, so maybe a little risky, but I'm going with Cameron Curl, now of the Los Angeles Rams. And Curl, much like Budda, is another one that produces strong tackle numbers and just doesn't necessarily have the big plays to propel him into that top 5 territory. But even last year, big play rate of 1.34%, that ranks 60th at the position. His tackling ability made him a top 10 safety for IDP in our scoring and safety 12 in points per game. There's nothing to be concerned about with Curl. I think he should be a nice fit there in Los Angeles, potentially getting a lot of work as that second linebacker next to Ernest Jones as well. Because if you look at that roster, there is no other linebacker that they're going to trust for a full-time role next to Ernest. And bringing Curl in, who has experience playing that role for Washington, it's kind of a nice, connect the dots level of encouragement that he'll continue to do so for the Rams and why they chose to bring him in the first place. So feeling great about Curl again this year. I know he was my dark horse safety 1 last year. And when I did that article, and he finished in the top 10. So I think that's a nice result from that. Again, just being such a difficult position to predict given all the year-to-year variance. DB9 is another one of those kind of my guy type players for me, and one that I think is continuously like underappreciated for IDP. But Grant Delpit of the Cleveland Browns offers everything that we're looking for, as mentioned in, kind of the preamble to start this episode, as far as like deployment, alignment, pass production. He's consistently a value in drafts. He missed 4 to 5 games last year. I'd imagine that he gets overlooked again this year in drafts, but Delpit shouldn't, again, he's coming off a really productive season, when he was in the lineup. I'm just looking at his numbers here. 81st percentile in tackles versus expected. That tied with Brian Branch. 81st percentile in tackles versus expected. What tied with Brian Branch was his tackle rate at or behind the line of scrimmage at 1.4%. And he also tied with Brian Branch in first contact rate as well. He was top 20 there. So big play rate was high, 2.34%. But he was safety 15 in points per game. So he's just really good. He's again, exactly what we're looking for. And the reason that he does get that points per game production inside the top 15 there is because that he gets the alignments and everything that we're looking for. So if we're banking on a full season, strong usage again in Jim Schwartz's defense, and we're talking baseline tackle production, first and foremost, he's going to be in the top 10 for me every time there. So that's kind of tier 1. DB is always, going to have the biggest top tier across like any of the positions, just because it's super deep. Anyone putting like only a handful of DBs in the top tier, you're just kind of setting yourself up for disappointment. Like that funnel absolutely needs to be wider with this position. So we'll get into tier 2 here, and to kick off tier 2, and this one is purely deployment based, because most drafters are not going to be taking Julian Blackmon of the Indianapolis Colts as a top 10 DB off the board. But if we're remaining consistent with the rankings, with the potential for ideal IDP alignments, then Blackmon's potential role in Gus Bradley's defense is about as good as it gets for IDP. Like that IDP safety 1 role, when I did the scheme-based tackle projection, ranked tied for second best in the league. So he tied with Grant Delpit's Browns, and actually tied with the next name on the list coming up as well, who we'll talk about in a second. But the only thing with Blackmon and why he moved down to tier 2 here is that he just hasn't shown that consistent high level production as of yet. But again, safety production is volatile. So it's not like we can't see it in 2024 if his usage remains the same, but finished 18th percentile in tackles versus expected. And to be fair to him, like he played a ton in the box, so that's naturally going to bring up his expected tackle number and set a high bar for him to clear. But even while finishing that low in tackles versus expected, he still delivered 13.3 points per game, which was good for safety 16 in our IDP scoring. So Gus Bradley loves a designated box safety to play a ton up near the line of scrimmage. And based on Indy's moves this offseason, it seems like that'll once again be Julian Blackmon in that role. So, if he gets even slightly more efficient with his tackles and even maybe get some big play luck, then, top 10 is not going to be that difficult to achieve because of that potential tackle production in that role alone. DB11 for me is another name from the IDP bounce back episode. It's Jeremy Chinn, now of the Washington Commanders. Washington's defense under Dan Quinn is one of those defenses that, projects as top 2 for the top safety in that, in tackle potential, right? So it's again tied with the Browns and the Colts, and considering Chinn's like history of usage in the NFL, or at least where he's been most impactful, I think that's exactly why Dan Quinn went out and got him in free agency, to be that box heavy, blitz heavy safety in this defense, which is excellent for IDP potential. And if that's the case where Chinn plays a full-time role this year, like we could be looking at a massive bounce back closer to what IDP managers had come to expect from him after his like insane rookie season, right? DB12 for me is the shining example of everything we want our IDP safeties to be based on his usage last season. It's Minnesota Vikings safety Josh Metellus, who to me easily my favorite safety target in Minnesota because of that potential usage alone. This man spent 73% of his 1,063 defensive snaps either in the box or in the slot. So those prime IDP alignments that we talked about at the top of the show, while only spending 55 of those 1,000 plus snaps as a deep safety. Like, just remarkable deployment, if you ask me. And luckily, Brian Flores is staying on as defensive coordinator this season, so the odds are favorable that we see very similar usage for Metellus in 2024, which for IDP is just as good as it gets, right? Like, this dude finished as safety 4 last year overall, and he was someone that actually delivered over expected despite the higher expectations in tackles versus expected based on that box heavy alignment. He finished 77th percentile in that regard. So the only thing that keeps me from putting him higher is like the excellent rookie season of Ivan Pace, which could earn Pace a bigger role in 2024 compared to last year. Minnesota only deployed their second linebacker on average for about 43.5% of snaps on a weekly basis. So the team gave a nice deal to Blake Cashman this offseason, assuming that, he's going to play the lead linebacker role in that defense. There could be enough of a trade-off in snaps between Pace and Metellus for that secondary linebacker role where Metellus's production declines a bit. But even if he isn't getting 1,000 plus snaps again, like that usage when he is on the field, I don't think that's going to change, like where he's playing in the box, in the slot, along the defensive line. And that keeps him in that elite kind of IDP safety range. So, I think that's what, for me at least, keeps him inside this top 12. All right, DB 13 and safety 12 for me is Minkah Fitzpatrick. We talk about consistent IDP production. Like, this dude is right up there with Derwin James in that regard. The only issue with Minkah is that his usage is much more of like a deep safety, right? So, that I will say that has, at least been there's been somewhat of a shift recently. His deployment still kind of ranks average at best, even with that shift in usage, but it at least could lead to lower weekly floors. But that being said, Minkah has been awesome when he's on the field. Like, since I've been collecting the tackles versus expected data starting in 2021, he's never finished below the 91st percentile of performers in that regard in any single season, including 95th percentile this year or this past year, despite only playing 10 games. Like, he's one of the kind of go-to outliers for strong tackle production from a mostly deep alignment. There aren't many, which is what makes them outliers, obviously. But Minkah keeps finding a way to be on that list every single year. So, he I think, to me, has to be a top 12 safety option at least. All right, DB 14 now with the Green Bay Packers. It's Xavier McKinney, who finished as safety 7 overall, and that was with the Giants. Now, for McKinney, he's a bit of a trickier projection because we don't know what new Packers defensive coordinator Jeff Hafley's defense is going to look like in the NFL. But as far as relying on like just safe bets for production based on past seasons, super safe bet for playing time based on his contract as well. Like, McKinney's likely going to be a strong, I think, IDP option once again this year. Okay, next up at DB 15, Jesse Bates III. Who went off last season, leading his position in tackles versus expected at plus 31.1, an unreal number to hit on. Finished tied with Antoine Winfield Jr. as safety 1 in total points and points per game. And there's going to be plenty of people who draft him higher than this because of his production last year. And as much as I love Jesse Bates, safety 15 probably is about as high, or DB 15, I should say, probably about as high as I want to put him, because I think we should absolutely be expecting some drop off in 2024. He's one of those, again, deep safety outliers from last season, like Minkah Fitzpatrick. The problem is that he doesn't have nearly the history of elite tackle production like Minkah Fitzpatrick has in recent years, which is the part that kind of worries me, right? And the other part of it is that the Falcons have an all new coaching staff coming in with a new defensive coordinator, where we should absolutely not expect similar success as a tackler for Bates based on just a scheme change alone, right? So Bates, as good as he is, like NFL wise for IDP, he's going to probably be a big time fade for me. The only thing really keeping him up here in the top 15 for 2024 is just the fact that he's good. He's capable of big time production, but it doesn't hold as much water when, considering everything else heading into this year. So safety 15, I think, is a fine spot for him. All right, a couple corners start to mix in here among this top 24 now, joining Brian Branch, who may not even actually be considered a corner come the start of the year on fantasy platforms. We'll have to wait and see there, but no doubt about these next two guys, basically. So starting with Nate Hobbs of the Las Vegas Raiders. We love slot corners for IDP purposes. They're closer to the action. They help in run support. They can blitz from that position as well. And Nate Hobbs is a nice bet to do all those things in 2024. We've got an elite production profile from him through his first 2 years in the league, ranking at least among the 98th percentile in tackles versus expected in each of his first 2 seasons. We're not really expecting much to change from him this year. Like, hopefully he doesn't miss games like he did in his first 2 years. And if he doesn't, then it's going to be a massive IDP season for Hobbs in Vegas. And then the other contender for that, top cornerback crown and an elite option as well, based on his performance last season, Devin Witherspoon of the Seattle Seahawks, just incredible numbers as a rookie, including 95th percentile in tackles versus expected, top 10 in big play rate, top 5 PFF grade, plays primarily in the slot, which we once again love. Like, if you want Witherspoon as CB1, I'm fine with that as well. These guys are really interchangeable, in my opinion, at corner, even at the very top. So if you believe in that elite big play rate to continue, which, it probably won't, then absolutely you can have him as CB1. Okay, DB 18. This one might change as we get into the preseason and kind of get more clarity on how the hell the Eagles are going to deploy their secondary. But as of right now, it's Reed Blankenship in this spot for me. I'm treating him as a starter right now, along with CJ Gardner-Johnson, while Sidney Brown is still recovering from a torn ACL, plus rumors of James Bradbury moving to safety. And who knows what's going to happen with Cooper DeJean. So right now, like, the way I'm projecting this depth chart, I have Blankenship here, but this could absolutely change. But for me, Blankenship, he's looked great in IDP terms. He ranked 98th percentile in tackles versus expected last season. Decent big play rate, really good at making first contact, which lends to that tackle production. Finished as safety 7 in points per game. Like, if he's a starter, then I like that to continue, at least to be among the top 20 DBs this year. So he is a former UDFA, who's just kind of fine as an NFL player, and Philly does have options. So that's why I kind of present this with at least some hesitancy, and it is subject to change once we maybe get a better grasp on what it's going to look like come the preseason, hopefully. All right, DB 19, another Seahawk joining Devin Witherspoon. It's Julian Love, and I'm going to be honest, it's hard not to love Julian Love. Like, he's just a producer. He did it his last year with the Giants in 2022, and then he continued it in 2023 with the Seahawks, where they were fine moving on from the overpaid Jamal Adams because Love just played that role a lot better. He was 94th percentile in tackles versus expected last season, 9.8% first contact rate, which was 3rd best at his position. Like, he's great at being around the ball and making the most of his opportunities. We don't know, exactly what Mike McDonald and Aiden Durd's defense is going to look like in 2024, but I like Love's chances of playing a full-time role combined with, his past history of production. He's in my top 20, and I think can be a nice value depending on where he ends up going once drafts really kind of start up in earnest this offseason. Okay, DB 20, not too far off from Reed Blankenship. It's his teammate CJ Gardner-Johnson, who again kind of comes with a similar question mark as Blankenship and how they'll use him, whether it's in the slot or safety. I'm treating him as safety right now, but who knows? That could change too, once Canadian hero Sidney Brown is fully healthy. But either way, might be kind of a group to avoid if you don't want to deal with that headache. But I like Gardner-Johnson having, shown a potential to deliver strong IDP production, both as a tackler and with the big plays last year. It was a small sample size, obviously, because he got hurt, but 1.7% tackle rate at or behind the line of scrimmage. That ranked third among safeties. 9.1% first contact rate. That ranked 15th. Like, he's a fun player. He's a productive one, and should be a locked-in IDP starter as long as he's a locked-in NFL starter. DB21 is Javon Holland of the Miami Dolphins, another one of the better NFL safeties from like a real football perspective, right? So you get no concerns for playing time, which helps a ton, but playing mostly deep, there is at least some hesitance to move him too far up the list here. You know, as good as he can be, he was safety 9 in points per game last year before missing some time. But you also get a new defensive coordinator coming into Miami this year in Anthony Weaver. He's coming over from Baltimore. We have no idea how to project Weaver's scheme right now. So we can only look at Holland kind of as a player and what he's done in the past, what's been his typical usage and strength. And while it brings him out of the top 10, which he was last year when he was out there, it's not enough to move him out of the top 24, right? Moves him down to DB 21 and safety 18 for me. So still like Holland quite a bit. Last name in tier 2, another Chicago Bears safety. So Brisker was safety 2, as we know, but safety 19, DB 22 is his new teammate, Kevin Byard. I mean, we talk about guys that have been consistently productive for IDP. Byard has to be in that conversation. Even last year, from going from Tennessee to Philly, he produced the best tackle total of his entire career and delivered in the 95th percentile in tackles versus expected, had almost no big plays, and still finished as safety 10 on the year. Like, I think, you know, the change again probably knocks him down enough some this year. And even with some, you know, positive regression and big plays, with tackles maybe not reaching those heights again, he should still be a really good option for IDP. And that's why he kind of remains in this second DB tier for me, but I don't think the tackles will quite reach the heights that they did in 2023. Okay, on to the last two names for today as they start off tier 3, which of course, much larger than these two names. And if you want to see the full list, you can find it in the episode description and on pff.com. But for the sake of this top 24, we'll stop there today. So wrapping it up with DB 23, Brandon Jones of the Denver Broncos. I love Jones as an IDP. We just haven't been able to get him in a full-time role for a full season, whether it was, you know, coaching shenanigans or injuries. It just hasn't happened yet for Jones, but I feel good about this year being the year for him. It's why he was in my DB IDP breakouts article, which is out now on pff.com. You know, I think putting it all together for a full season is going to be huge for him. He's consistently delivered among the best tackle versus expected performers at his position year in and year out, even when he isn't getting nearly as many snaps as others, you know, to kind of pad those numbers. Like, Jones has just been incredibly efficient with his opportunities. He's never played more than 644 defensive snaps in his career, which happened back in 2021. But now he's looking like a locked-in starter for the Broncos. So if healthy, he should, I think, easily clear that snap total, and then the production should come along with it for Brandon Jones. Okay, last name for today at DB24. It's Cam Bynum of the Minnesota Vikings. People will probably argue for him to be higher on this list after last season. He finished as a safety 3 overall and in points per game. But to me, Bynum might be the biggest regression candidate among those top scorers last year. And it doesn't have to be so much to push him outside of the top 24 DBs, but I think it's going to be relatively close this year. He's another deep safety by trade, much like Jesse Bates, who delivered well over expected in his tackle totals last year, which, you know, you look at Bynum based on his past production, there isn't like any real indication that he can repeat at that level. It's not like he's Minkah Fitzpatrick or anything like that. And you know, maybe he proves me wrong and does do it again. He's going to be in the same defense with the same coaching staff, so that does help. I do not see him reaching those heights again. It's very similar to Jalen Petre from 2022 to 2023, like playing deep almost all the time makes those numbers very difficult to repeat. So he's a big fade for me, even if I do think he can be startable for IDP, as this DB24 ranking would suggest, right? So just beware of where you're drafting somebody like Cam Bynum after the big year last year. But yeah, that's going to do it for today. I hope you found that helpful. Again, always feel free to reach out or shout in the comments your thoughts or questions. I'm always happy to engage. Again, we're ranking based on baseline tackle production more than anything else, right? Because those big plays, again, not something anyone is able to predict. So please keep that in mind before yelling at me for these rankings. So for today, those are the top 24. This isn't necessarily a group that, people who are fading DB will get a lot of shares in, but still worth going through why these guys are ranked the way they are. So you know what to look for when drafts start happening, and why I think, that info at the top covering what is important about DB expectations for IDP is arguably more valuable than the rankings themselves, right? So I'll be back with linebacker rankings next week. You can find the full rankings for all positions on PFF.com. The DB rankings article I'll link in the description here. I have also written up 3 IDP breakout articles on PFF.com covering the defensive linemen, linebackers, and defensive backs for this season. So check those out as well. Thank you all so much for tuning in and listening. I appreciate you all. If you are on the YouTube, it's a big help to like and subscribe. I always appreciate that as well. But yeah, until next time, peace out.